Hi everyone and welcome to the sew along video. So this is a knit garment and the seams have been made with a 6mm, which is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when you're ready, set up your overlocker with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric and make sure that the seam allowance is set to 6mm or 1/4 inch wide. In addition to this, you are going to need a plain sewing machine, so make sure you put a ball needle into that machine, and it's a good idea to set your stitch width longer than normal. If you normally work on a 2.5, pop it up to maybe a 3.5 and do a test stitch on 2 layers of fabric before you begin. In addition to this, we are going to need either a cover stitch machine to sew the hems with, or you're going to need a twin needle on a domestic sewing machine. Now if you don't have access to either of those, you can just overlock and plain stitch it. I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to go ahead with this video assuming you only have access to an overlocker and a plain stitch sewing machine, but just bear in mind if you do use a plain sewing machine that there's not a lot of give in those seams, so if you put them under any pressure they may snap the threads. Ideally a twin needle on a domestic machine or a cover stitch hem is the best option. So when you're ready, let's get started. I'm going to sew the version with the bishop sleeve. So the first thing we're going to get started on is the upper front. So this is the area with the ties. So you're going to need these pattern pieces like this. So when we've cut them, we've cut 2 pairs, which means 4 mirrors. So we've cut 2 like this, and then we've turned the pattern over and we've cut 2 like this. So we need to sew a right and a left front, but because they're mirrors, unless you've used a different fabric for the lining, which I do not suggest, we can just go ahead and start sewing these. It doesn't matter whether you get them round the wrong way. So what we're looking for on the pattern piece is when you pick it up, there'll be a notch here on the lower edge. We need to sew from that notch around and up to here, which is the shoulder edge. So that will give our centre front. Now it's a really good idea to not stretch this as you sew. Try not to stretch this garment out at all as you sew. So don't pull on it when you run it through the overlocker, or you may find you might need to stabilise some of these seams with clear elastic, which is called Mobilon. So what we're going to do is start sewing at the notch here. Start overlocking at that lower notch there. And when you've done one side, go ahead and do the other one as well. Now that notch that we sewed to is the centre front. So what we're going to do now is just trim that off slightly and turn this so wrong sides are together. Now we need to find the pieces that look like this, and these are also cut as a pair. So it doesn't matter which one you decide is the front and which one is going to be the lining either. So the notch I mentioned on that pattern piece needs to match to the notch here. Now that can be a little bit difficult to do, so what I'm going to do is tack stitch these in place on my plain sewing machine before we come back to the overlocker here. Take one of these lower front pieces, the front waistband piece, and find that notch at the centre. Then what we're going to do is just tack stitch this in place. So this piece is the right front as you wear it. What we want to do is turn it over so that the edge we finished our overlocking in is at the top, and you want to find that notch position there. Making sure those edges are really evenly lined up. This should be what happens to your pattern piece. So what I'm going to do is place that to the side here, and I'm just going to run a line of tacking stitches within the seam allowances. So my seam allowances are 6mm, 1/4 inch. It's just so I don't have to remove them later. All I'm going to do is just run a small line of stitching through here, just to hold that in place. Now I'm just going to take this tie, pop it out of the way, pop this side of the piece out of the way, and we need to do exactly what we've done in reverse for the other piece. So here is my shoulder, here, this is the left as if I was wearing it. I'm going to turn it over, and you'll know you've got it in the right place when the tie's in the centre. I'm going to come to that area that I finished the overlocking, and where that notch is needs to match exactly on top of the other piece, and we need to make sure that all of our raw edges together. I'm going to match that to the top edge. Now this can be a little tricky, which is the reason we're going to be tack stitching it before we overlock it. Now don't worry too much if you do miss this with the overlocker, you can easily run it over with the plain sewer later. So I'm just going to come right up to the top and tack stitch that in place. And I'm only tack stitching not even an inch, it's whatever you feel comfortable with, so a couple of centimetres, 1/2 inch. So when we're finished, if you open this up, what we're going to have is this. So just double check that you've got this around the right way. So you'll have the ties here ready to be tied up, and then the shoulders here in the front. So when you're ready, let's go back to our overlocker and overlock this piece into place. Before we overlock that seam together, we're going to sew in the side front, so you'll have a pair that look like this. Take one of the pieces and right sides together. We want to sew it into this area here. You'll find a notch part way down that you need to match to, and that notch is actually at the bust point. So once you've sewn that together, come back to the area we tack stitched. What we want to be doing is overlocking from the side seam edge through to our tack stitch area, and you'll find there are notches to match as you go. If you match those at the side seam, you'll see notches here, so we're sewing through a single layer at the moment. The next notch position to match is the seam we've just sewn between the side front, and you'll be transitioning from one layer here and one layer on the back to one layer on the front and two on the bottom. Now the best way to get a nice sharp edge through that centre front with the ties is to overlock straight off the edge. So we want to overlock through, up to our tack stitching where you can see here, and then off without catching any of this other fabric. So that's what we're looking for, the left front of the bodice. Now go ahead and repeat what you've done on the other side. So the side front in, and then overlock the seam in to the centre. So when you've finished, what's going to happen is you're probably going to be left with something like this, and we haven't haven't overlocked in our lining piece yet, which is the mirror of this. So that's why I suggest you overlock this twice. Now, I'm a reasonably good sewer. I've been sewing for a long time and I still find it really difficult to get this right. So that's why I overlock this seam twice. If you're a good sewer and you're really confident, you can just overlock all these layers at once. So what I'm doing is now I'm basically going to re-overlock this seam. It's not the most perfect way and it's not the way it probably should be done, but it's the only way you can guarantee of getting a really good result. So what we've got is our bodice there, and we've got basically right sides together, our front waistband in between. So here's the seam we've just sewn. I'm going to overlock it and I'm going to basically cut off what I've just overlocked, and I'm going to use this method just to tidy up that center area. And I know I shouldn't, but I'm going to go slightly further in than the 6mm. So if you've made any mistakes on your first sewing round, this will give you a chance to rectify them. So what we're doing is creating the facing on the inside for the waistband. So that's what it's going to look like on the outside. So as I said, if you're a good sewer, you can sew all of that in one. I tend to sew it twice. I know it's not perfect, and it's probably not the, well, I know it's not the correct way of doing it, and it also ends up with a bulkier seam, but I find it just adds a little bit of firmness there. So once you've done one side, go ahead and do the other side. So when you've finished doing that, hopefully your centre seam will be nice and perfect and nice and tight together. As you can tell, I've ended up with a small gap, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. The ties are going to be tied in nice and tight, and it's not going to show anything. But just to make sure that that is fully enclosed, if you need to, go to your plain stitch sewing machine and run a line of stitching there. So as you can feel that there's a little bit more bulk there. As I said, you don't have to do this double stitching method. Certainly if you're really confident with your sewing, put them all together. So what we're looking for is the band right side up, the garment right side up, the band right side down, and stitch through those layers if you're a confident sewer. Okay. So there is our front done. Now we're going to work on the back neckline. Here is our upper back piece. It has a notch here to show you the turn position for the hem. So what we're going to do is, if you have a cover stitcher, just cover stitch that at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. If you don't, I'm going to overlock and flat stitch it. So just overlook it on the very edge, and then go to your plain machine and turn it at that 1 centimetre mark and flat stitch that down, or if you have a twin needle, just twin needle that down. Come to the neckline. Now I'm going to do this from the wrong side, but you're more than welcome to do it from the right side if you prefer. Turn that, and as you can tell, my fabric's fighting a bit to get a nice curve there without causing a wrinkle or a tunnel, so I'm not going to fight that with my fabric today. It certainly didn't do this with the last sample I do it. I'm just going to go ahead like that. We can hide that little missing bit within the seam of our shoulder. So I'm just going to turn that under, and you see it's sitting nicely. So don't fight your fabric. If it doesn't want to go under the full 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, just do whatever you think is correct. So I'm going to stitch through this overlocking line. Now it's really important not to stretch out this back neckline, which is really easy to do when you're doing this sort of thing. If you need to, you may need to stabilize this with some clear elastic, which is also known as Mobilon, and you can just run that into the seam as you sew. We really don't want to stretch this neckline out. Right, because that's such a narrow neckline, I'm not going to run a second line of stitching in it. I'm just going to go ahead now and let's sew this into the shoulders of our garment. So here is our bodice front, and as you can tell, I've tied the little ties up already. You don't really need to do that. What we're going to do now is sew the back to the front at the shoulders. The main thing to remember is we need to end up sewing this right sides together. So what I'm going to do is place the front right side up and my back right side down. And I'm going to start working on the shoulder here, which is the right, as if you wear it. But what I'm going to do, so I don't get confused, is just pin the left shoulder into place, and you'll see why in just a moment. So come to the right shoulder here. Because I want to create a seamless transition from the back to the front, what I'm going to do is wrap the back within the front layers. What does that mean? Well, what that means is if we match this on the front layer at the shoulder, we want to bring this back layer over and wrap it to the shoulder. So if you do that and just sew some stitches to hold that into place, like that. Now the reason I do that is because I want to make sure that the fold point of this back is butted in really tight to the front. So what I often find is easy to do is to get some tweezers, which I can't find at the moment, so I'm just going to use a pin and just slide that there. I'm going to hold it really tight up, if I can, against the inside of that seam. And when I've got everything into position, I'm going to overlock that shoulder in place. So what you end up with is a nice smooth transition from the back to the front, and as well as that your shoulder seams are hidden. So when you've done that on that side, we're going to repeat the process for the other side, which is why pinning it into place comes in handy, because often you can get the layers confused. So come back to your pin position. You'll have two right sides together, and then come back and wrap that around and bring that to the other side. So a couple of stitches to hold it into place. And we have another one all nicely done. So just double check that you didn't mess that up and that we have the right sides together, and if you're happy with that, we can now move on. So now we're going to sew the sleeves, and these are a bishop sleeve, so we need to sew the sleeve, we need to sew the elasticated cuff. So you're going to need the sleeve, you're going to need the cuff pieces, and you're going to need some elastic. Now I've suggested 8mm elastic. You can use 6, it won't matter. You probably starting to push it if you get up to 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. So you want under 3/8 of an inch. The other thing is the elastic measurement is approximate only for a size medium. So what you can do is put that elastic around your wrist and just check it's comfortable before you begin. Certainly make it longer or shorter to suit. So let's start with the sleeve. We have a pair, so we've cut one like this and one like this. And as we look at the sleeve, we have a notch here, which is the crown notch, and down one of the sides we have 2 notches. So the 2 notches show us that is the back of the sleeve. Now this pattern piece is not symmetrical, it's not cut on the fold, and we need to know the front from the back. So take one of your sleeves and match it right sides together to your garment. We're going to start overlocking at the side seam, making sure that we match the double notch on our sleeve to the 2 notches on the body of our garment here. Then as we progress up, we want to make sure the next notch is at the shoulder seam. There is ease in this pattern, so you might need to slightly stretch these to suit. That notch there needs to match to the seam we sewed at the shoulders just before. Okay, so go ahead and repeat that on the other side. Before we can sew in the underarm, we need to sew in the back waistband. So come to the back area, and in the center of the back you'll find 2 notches. Take your back waistband pattern piece and overlock from side seam to side seam. Right, so come to the cuff area on one of those sleeves, the lower area, the lower hem area, and fold that sleeve right sides together. We're going to overlock through the underarm of the sleeve, and part way up you'll find a notch to match, and then we need to make sure that these underarm pieces sit on top of each other. And as we overlock through to the other side, we want to make sure that these waistband seams sit on top of each other as well. And when you've done one side, go ahead and repeat that on the other side. Now you'll have 2 cuff pieces. Fold them right sides together and overlock the short ends. Now you're going to need your elastic pieces. Create a loop with your elastic and stitch that down. The overlap I've allowed for is 1.2 centimeters, so I've overlapped them by 6 mil. So what that means is ½ inch. And then just secure that in the way that you like to secure it. Take one of your cuff pieces and place the elastic inside the cuff and turn the cuff wrong sides together. Now to make this easy to sew on, I'm going to tack stitch this with my machine. So what I'm going to do is just run a row of stitches really close to the edge. It's only going to be 3 mil or 1/8 of an inch. I've quartered this off so there'll be markings to guide you. Now, as a hint, all you need to do is stretch the elastic, not the band.
So when you put that elastic in there, there's an amount allowed for here, which is ease. So that's just to make it easier to sew on with. It's easy to tack stitch this first. You don't have to do this tack stitching. I just find it makes it just so much easier. So let's go back to our overlocker and attach that. Oh, do the other one and then we'll go back to our overlocker. If you come to the cuff area of the sleeve, you'll see we have notches. So we have the seam, a notch halfway along, a quarter of the way along, and a notch at the halfway point. Take one of these cuff pieces and place it inside the sleeve so we have right sides together. And hold that in place with a pin. Now down our cuff piece you will also have notches, so that is quartered off, so that notch matches to the quarter point. We have another notch at the halfway point. And then our last quarter point there. So what we need to do is overlock this into position, stretching to fit, which sounds easy. When we overlock, you have to make sure that you don't catch the elastic in this seam. Make sure you take out those pins. We do not want to run over pins with our overlocker. And just double check when you've done that the seam is completely enclosed, because it's very easy to miss when you're stretching out the elastic. Okay, so when you've done it on this side, go ahead and repeat it on the other side. So now we're moving on to the skirt piece. Take your front and place it right side up, and your back and right side down. Now you'll know the difference because the back has got a double notch in the center of the upper back here, and as well as that the hemline has a slight curve in it, and that's just a booty adjustment. Make sure it fits nicely over the bottom and that the back of the dress doesn't ride up. So we're going to match and sew the side seams. Now it's a good idea with the side seams here, if you haven't already, that you sew the seams in the same directions. If you sew from the top to the bottom on one side, make sure you sew from the top to the bottom on the other. Right, so I'm going to jump the gun a bit here and do the hem because there's not so much bulk involved. So there is a 2 centimeter hem allowance, which is 3/4 of an inch. So if you need to, go and press that with your iron and then cover stitch it. Or if you're going to do it the same way I am, I'm going to overlock and then plain stitch. So starting at the side seam, I'm going to turn up my hem allowance. And with this garment, it's 2 centimeters that's been allowed for, which is 3/4 of an inch, but if you adjust that, it's really not going to make a huge amount of difference. Now because I like the look of a cover stitcher, even though I'm not using my cover stitcher, I'm going to run a second line of stitching parallel to the first line of stitching on the fold side, entirely up to you. Okay, so trim off any stray threads and then we're going to move back to our overlocker and finish the garment. So now we're going to sew the skirt into the lower waistband of our garment. Now you will find there are 3 layers here. So we have 2 layers, which is our front, and the single layer is our back. So match the double notch here on the back to the double notch on our waist skirt area. So turn the skirt right side out and put it inside the waistband area. And the double notch there matches the double notch on the waistband. Then our side seams should match. So pop a pin there and hold that into place if you need to. And making sure everything is lined up so all our raw edges are together. Match the single notch on the lower waistband of the front to the single notch at the waist area on the skirt. And then lastly our side seam on the other side. Now make sure those waistbands do sit on top of each other. It'll give you a much nicer finished product. Now the other thing is when you sew this seam, If you're not careful, it can stretch out of place, so you may need to afterwards, or you could do it now if you want to, stabilize the seam with Mobilon, which is clear elastic. I didn't on the first garment I sewed of this, and I'm just going to check this after it's sewn to see if it needs on this. But just when you're ready, start overlocking from a side seam. And try not to stretch this out too much either. Right, so that's our garment finished. Go ahead and press your garment if your fabric allows. Use a press cloth if you have something like I'm sewing which has some rayon in it. It's a single brushed poly rayon spandex, I believe. It's really soft, but you can't iron it without a press cloth. So go ahead and press your garment and you're finished. So thanks for joining me with this sew along video. I hope you enjoy your garment, and I look forward to you joining me for my next sew along video soon.